Chapter 10. The Birth of the Spiritual Spheres. There is something of vast importance that must be discussed at this point, because having examined how the fall, that break away from the rest of creation, was created, and it was of course created, it was designed in the minds of those that are still living it. The important aspect that must be examined this afternoon is what happened to the rest of creation. Of course, the rest of creation did not go away because the fall had taken place. The rest of creation continued as it always had done, and always will do, with the exception of this sore point, this area of insensitivity, this portion of itself that was suddenly unreachable, unhelpable, and unhealable. Of course, the angelic host, involved in the debate that went backwards and forwards for millennia before the fall took place, were instantly aware at the point the decision had been made by those angelic children responsible for the fall that the distancing had taken place. They were instantly aware, as they had been before the debate took place and before the decision had been reached, that those fallen souls were in trouble and needed to be reconnected with the whole in full consciousness. Those souls had plunged themselves into a darkness of their own making, and into a belief in heavy matter and solidified illusion, to the exclusion of any conscious realization of being more than part of that illusion they had created. Therefore, it was necessary to bring suggestion of change into their world. Suggestion, because of free will, the angelic beings who were involved in the fall had taken that decision. And if they elected to remain within that illusion, then there was nothing that any being, or God, could do according to his own structure of his universes. If, however, the fallen decided by their own volition that they no longer wanted to be fallen, then slowly they could be extricated from the soup of illusion, or thick tar of possibility turned into certainty, that they had plunged themselves into by their own thoughts and decision. The first thing that happened was that a self-elected number of the angelic host decided that they would ring this area of the fall, or area of space, and pour light into it to counter the continuing and accelerating effects of the fall. So, in physical terms, although this is not an exact analogy, they surrounded this area of space with light, and continue to do so in part of their consciousness. Then they unified in purpose, and that purpose was to bring an atmosphere into the area of the fall within which advanced beings, i.e. part of the angelic host, could incarnate by free will into the center of the fall experiment to teach and to illuminate. And so for some time light was constantly poured, beamed and projected into the area of illusion of the earth and its surrounding space to lighten, quite literally, to some extent, the solidified molecules of thought that had created a permanence within the illusion, a permanence of ideas, and a permanence of creation that was accepted by the fallen as the ultimate and only reality. Investing those molecules with light meant that eventually certain members of the fallen were elevated in consciousness to the point where they began to consider their spiritual aspects. Not only that, but there was enough light to begin the process of bringing in members of the angelic host who, despite knowing that a great portion of their spiritual memory would be erased and masked by the effects of the fall, elected to come in time and again, incarnation after incarnation, in order to bring light to the fallen from within. Those souls prepared to enter the physical vehicle via the process that kept bringing people back into this area of physicality. They prepared and formed links with members of the angelic host best suited to maintaining a supply of light to them during their incarnations in order to allow them to elevate the souls of the fallen in consciousness. and to bring back to the souls of the fallen a multidimensionality to their thoughts, so that they could begin to consider spiritual aspects of their lives, because for a long time they didn't. For a long time it was today, and the life they were living now on the earth plane, that was all there was, according to their philosophy. There was the acquisition of power and the maintenance of survival, and that was all they wished to consider. There was no consideration at all of anything beyond what they could experience with their physical senses. This is where the beginnings of religion can be found. As light was poured in to affect the molecules of the illusion that had been created by the fallen, certain members of the community of the angelic children, divorced from the rest of creation because of the effects of the fall, were able to elevate themselves. Always it had to be to elevate themselves, to a point where they considered what was beyond, that there was something beyond, and to address that in their own individual ways by inventing someone beyond in their own image. You say that God made man in his own image. Originally, man made God in his own image, because that was the only image he had at that time. And so religions were propagated in various areas of the globe as points where people could consider and imagine. Because first they had to imagine the possibility of there being something other than the heavy matter that they found themselves trapped in. Invariably and inevitably, as time passed by, these religions would become corrupted by the imbalance in the number of souls who were considering spirituality and the number of souls who were investing continuously in the illusion of the fall. So inevitably, and in almost all cases, religions will become corrupted. But as the souls of the fallen considered spirituality increasingly, albeit under conditions that were imposed upon them by their fellow members and which restricted their approach to spirituality, a certain amount of light was let into the world. As a result of that, other souls were able to complete their mission of presenting spiritual knowledge that had a higher vibration to the members of the fallen. In many cases, they were put to death. In many cases, they had to exist as reclusive beings and be content to promote light from within the illusion. Many souls would spend many lifetimes incarnating again and again to simply sit quietly away from the masses and direct light towards the masses, to see the atmosphere being lightened, being rarefied, and becoming more spiritual. Then, because of these teachers, and because of religion at that time allowing a certain, not much, but a certain amount of light into the mix, there came a point where, upon physical death, which is simply the exhaustion of available power to an individual on this level, rather than an instant reincarnation due to the pull of the fall, that soul was open to an amount of suggestion and counselling before going back into the effects of the fall. Areas were constructed that consisted of molecules of light and molecules of the effects of the fall. Molecules that were not as dense as those found within the world that had been created as an effect of the fall. As souls were able to be counselled by angelic beings once they had left a physical life behind, and before they returned to another physical life, drawn in initially by the immense physical pull of the field, slowly areas were constructed where they could rest, could contemplate, and could be taken outside of the illusion, to view it from the outside, and to consider for themselves that it was an illusion that didn't need to be returned to at best, or at worst, that it could be returned to with them carrying the seed of spiritual truth within them, so that they could, during a successive lifetime, enlighten themselves and others by their presence, to the point where, when they next came back to one of the spiritual resting places, they would consider for longer that they needn't go back into the fall effects, and could consider what the fall was about. It is analogous to a primary school and to a number of successive classrooms becoming available to students as they grow in knowledge and self-awareness. Self-awareness referring to spirituality. I have just described the beginnings of the spiritual spheres. Those spiritual spheres that in so many religions are considered to be heaven, and to be all that there is awaiting the angelic soul once it has left physical death behind. Those cleansing spheres, which we have examined to quite an extent in the previous book. Here Joseph is making a reference to your life after death. Were constructed gradually. First there was an immediate sphere around the earth, as it were, not quite permeating the earth, but around the earth and the effects of the fall. Then, as souls hovering between one physical incarnation and another were illumined by the teachers from the angelic host within that sphere, the molecules of that particular sphere could be further enlightened, or helped to create a more etheric sphere around and permeating that one. Gradually, therefore, the souls from within the fall were able to extricate themselves sphere by sphere as they rediscovered their true heritage and their true potential to the point where they could eventually escape from the effects of the fall. The angelic hosts involved in the process initially were legion and spent most of their time and invested most of their consciousness in love in extricating the souls that were trapped in the fall. However, as souls were gradually extricated from the fall, they themselves became teachers in the spirit realms and were able to take over much of the process of maintaining those spirit realms and addressing those souls that remained within the fall in an attempt to bring them out of their spiritual slumbers. I hope that this now also explains why there is a need for guides and the true meaning of spiritual guidance. Spiritual guidance is not about which road you should travel upon a particular day per se. It is about which decision you should make on a particular day in order to extricate yourself and others from the effects of the fall. Souls for whom escape is possible, via the spiritual spheres, often decide that they will, through love, remain in the spiritual spheres in order to influence certain groups of souls on earth. Through suggestion given via the intuition of those souls, during the lifetimes on earth of those groups of souls, in the hope that those groups are at a point where they can elevate themselves above the illusion to the extent where they can choose to either filter through the spiritual spheres and escape back into the angelic host consciousness, the God consciousness, or can influence people on earth in order to raise their vibrations too. So, what we have been discussing today is a gigantic and ongoing rescue operation. And I would like to say to listeners that it is time to consider the spiritual spheres for what they truly are. Not the encapsulated and finite heavens that are spoken about in many religions. And remember, as we have discussed earlier, most religions have been polluted to some extent inevitably by the effects of the fall. But rather staging posts and a series of steps. A series of steps with each one emerging into a more brilliant amount of light. And the final step being taken to extricate oneself finally from the effects of the experiment and regain one's original knowledge of who one was as an angelic being, and to remove oneself from the experiment altogether. Necessary, I think at this point, to have discussed the construction of, the evolution of, and the purpose of the spiritual spheres. It is sad, therefore, to consider that so many souls have chosen and do choose to reject that point of their consciousness that is made available to them by teachers and by themselves when they leave the physical body behind for a time. This is something that we will discuss and examine in a future chapter. The repeat of the experiment and the repeating investment in cataclysm rather than in illumination. But for now, I feel that I have sufficiently given a sketch of the instigation, birth and purpose of the spiritual spheres. So at this point, I will invite questions, please.
Joseph, you've mentioned in the past that there are souls existing on planets within our solar system that escaped the fall. Are they also investing their experience and time in this rescue mission?
It is primarily a project of the angelic host. The angelic host not meaning the entire angelic host, which is vast and occupies a number of different creative areas, but particularly the angelic host who were originally involved in the attempt to prevent the fall from happening. It is those angelic beings who feel more sharply the lack of the souls who are now enmeshed in the effects of the fall. I wish I could communicate to you the amount of love and compassion that exists within those members of the angelic host who are involved in extricating the souls on earth from the effects of the fall. You exhibit and experience grief on earth when a relative or a close friend passes. But that grief is nothing compared to the grief that is constantly felt by the members of the angelic host who are involved in the rescue mission to reach members of the fall. Primarily, it is an angelic mission, and the inhabitants of other spheres and areas of space are not generally involved in it. They are carrying out God's purpose and their purpose as beings passing through certain areas of inspiration and possibility. That is an ongoing purpose of creation, and that is happening everywhere, except in this area. Do you see what I am trying to...
Yes.
So, their consciousness is concerned with the ongoing bliss of creative potential, and on behalf of everyone, the whole of creation and God, of experiencing new vistas and situations that are in harmony with the creative matrix of God thought. It is the members of the angelic host that were involved in attempting to prevent a decision they knew would be wrong and harmful that were mostly involved in the creation of the spiritual spheres, and to some extent are now involved in the continuing attempted rescue of souls within the fall. I have to say that I didn't conclude something. There are so many strands of thought that I have to try and shoehorn into a stream of communication, in that the members of the angelic host have, to a great extent, left the re-evolution of the members of the fall to those spirits who have escaped into the spiritual spheres that nest the earth, and are responsible for teaching and enlightening the other souls. That is not to say that they have abandoned the souls that are trapped within the fall. They haven't. But there is a lesser amount of their consciousness involved in the process. They are always there and always present, but only to a degree now, as there is only a degree of their consciousness that is involved in that fall rescue mission. The reason for that is to give power back to those souls who have discovered what happened in the fall and have regained their spiritual consciousness, because in giving power back to them, you empower them to the extent that they have a greater ability to empower the souls who are emerging from the fall. So it is, again, a free will concept that eventually, through a greater and greater and greater free will, in saying, this was wrong, we have got to get out of here, everybody is pulled out. So the person at the top of the pile is constantly reaching down to the bottom of the pile to pull those souls up in consciousness so that they can regain a sense of who they were and, through free will, decide for themselves that they now need to move on from this imprisoning state of affairs. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Is there another question, please? The power is going.
It's just a quick clarification of the term angelic host. Is the angelic host what you originally said was like in a university where they sat in a room and gave birth to the angelic children who became humankind? Is that what you mean?
Yes. It is the glory and mystery of God, that God is one and God is many. On a spiritual level, free from the restrictions of physical matter and the constant need to draw on form in order to experience, God exists as multiples. God is one, but God is also multiples. If I can try to enlighten you further in what I have just said, you are each one of those multiples, and a group soul is one of those multiples. Any group that groups together in unified purpose is one of those multiples. Just as there are multiples in Earth society, political multiples, emotional multiples, religious multiples. You group yourselves together in areas and in numbers of purpose. You are each individuals, but you are each a part of God. It is certain multiples that were involved in the university analogy I gave you earlier, that decided that they would challenge the then proposed experiment. And it is those multiples that most feel the loss of those souls involved in the fall. However temporary, for in time all souls will escape. From their point of view, not quite putting it in earthly terms, it is as though they feel a responsibility, in that they could not ultimately, and in love, make those souls involved aware of the dangers of going through with the change in the speed of matter that resulted in the fall. It isn't guilt, it is a great responsibility in them, with them feeling, now with only a degree of their consciousness, if only we could have made them see. We tried, and we tried, and we tried, and we put forward scenarios and showed them, to the best of our ability, what would happen. If only we could have made them see. There is a great feeling of we must involve ourselves to some extent until every single soul has escaped from the effects of that mistake. Do you see?
Yes.
I will attempt one further question.
It reminds me of something biblical, the parable of the return of the prodigal son.
We have poured images for thousands of years into the subconscious in this particular societal structure that are relevant to what has happened. Teachers have brought through repeating patterns of spiritual truth, which, when heeded and adopted, cause enlightenment. And those stories and allegories can be found not only throughout the history of this society, but throughout the history of the societies that preceded it. This is how we work, and you have mentioned it yourselves this week, in that you have stated how science fiction allows spiritual values and circumstances to be examined. Because of course we do not only seek to push this information through those who are spiritually minded, we will put this information in wherever we can. It is group information from those souls that are escaping the field, pushed into the matrix to those who are visionaries. And by visionaries, I do not just mean leaders, but those who write, and those who produce visuals, those who sing and put together lyrics, those who write poetry. Any visionary soul who can tap into the greater consciousness or greater multiple and bring through truths from, according to their viewpoint, beyond. And so, yes, it is the prodigal son. It is all the Bible stories that have not been polluted by the effects of the fall. It is every illustration that has been brought to man for millennia through religious outpourings, through mystic outpourings, through poetry and dance and music. Anything that illustrates from beyond the path that should be taken to reach beyond the illusion of the earth. Is that sufficient?
Yes, thank you.
I wish at this time to guard you over the Christmas period and to protect you from what is quite a dangerous time for many people. And because you have volition and have worked with us for so long, I wish to tell each of you that around yourself and your families this Christmas, there will be those who will protect, those who will attempt to calm you, and those, and I say this with a smile on my face, who will prepare you for the work ahead. This is only a comma. And here Joseph is referencing our Christmas break in transmission, due to the imminent holiday. This is only a short stop along the way at a tavern, where you can eat and drink before you move on to do even more work. I should say that I am sorry for this, but I am not. Why should I be sorry, and why should you be sorry, for work that actually changes souls from within and brings illumination to them? I bless you this afternoon, and I wish you to know that there are many workers that you do not normally see. We have mentioned them, you have seen some of them, and you know them by nickname, but there are many, many souls with you. They each wish me at this point, although I am pushing to put more information through instead, to remember them to you. And remember is the important word, to remember. To join again with you as your true family, as your limitless family, that has never been away from you, that appreciates what you do, and to give you that sense of belonging at this time. God, through each of us, blesses you. God, outside of each of us, blesses you. God, within you, blesses you. We bless you, and we love you.